Hunter finds 3 bear cubs on the brink of death, but when the mother bear arrived, the rustic cabin stood alone against the backdrop of Alaska's wilderness, just outside Juneau's city limits. Inside, Ethan Walker moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had long ago learned to live with only himself for company. His weathered hands traced the outline of an old photograph before tucking it away in a drawer, a habit he had developed over years of solitude. The morning light filtered through frost-covered windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor, each beam highlighting the sparse furnishings that marked his simple existence. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching us from. Stay tuned, Ethan's past, as a professional hunter remained locked away in the recesses of his mind, much like the hunting gear he had stored in the cabin's basement. He preferred it that way. The locals knew better than to ask questions about the quiet man who occasionally ventured into town for supplies. His interactions were limited to brief nods and essential conversations, creating an invisible barrier between himself and the world he had chosen to leave behind. The day started like any other, with Ethan performing his usual routine of checking the perimeter of his property. The crisp morning air carried the familiar scents of pine and snow, a combination that had become as natural to him as breathing. But something felt different that morning, a subtle shift in the forest's rhythm that his years of experience couldn't ignore. As he walked his usual path, the sound of weak whimpers caught his attention. Following the noise, he discovered 3 bear cubs huddled together near a fallen log. Their condition made his heart clench. They were severely undernourished, their small bodies trembling with weakness. Years of professional instinct told him to walk away. Getting involved with wild animals, especially bear cubs, was asking for trouble. Yet something in their desperate situation struck a chord deep within him. The decision to help them went against everything his training had taught him, but as he carefully approached the cubs, memories of another time, another place, flickered through his mind. He had sworn never to interfere with nature's course again, but watching these helpless creatures stirred something he thought he had buried long ago. With gentle movements, Ethan created a makeshift shelter near his cabin, using his knowledge to provide the cubs with appropriate nourishment and warmth. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice how their eyes followed his every move, filled with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. The smallest of the 3, barely able to stand, pressed against his siblings, reminding Ethan of a vulnerability he understood all too well. That evening, as darkness settled over the forest, Ethan sat on his cabin's porch, listening to the usual symphony of night sounds. The cubs were safely settled in their temporary shelter, and he found himself wondering about their mother's whereabouts. His experience told him that a mother bear wouldn't abandon her cubs without reason, and the thought troubled him more than he cared to admit. The peace of the evening was suddenly shattered by a deep resonating sound that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't the typical calls of nocturnal creatures or the whisper of wind through trees. This was something primal, something that spoke to the ancient connection between man and wilderness. Ethan's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, but he stopped himself. Years of experience had taught him that sometimes the best defense was understanding. Grabbing his flashlight, he ventured out to investigate. The beam of light revealed massive paw prints near the cub's shelter, larger than any he had seen in recent years. The mother bear was clearly nearby, and Ethan knew he had placed himself in a precarious position by interfering with her offspring. But as he studied the tracks more closely, he noticed something unusual about their pattern. They circled the shelter but never approached it directly, as if the mother was assessing the situation rather than rushing in to reclaim her cubs. The sound came again, closer this time, and Ethan slowly turned to face its source. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood one of the largest female bears he had ever encountered. Her presence commanded respect, but what struck him most was her demeanor. Instead of the immediate aggression he expected, she stood her ground, studying him with an intelligence that seemed almost human. The standoff between Ethan and the mother bear lasted what felt like an eternity. Her eyes, reflecting the beam of his flashlight, held a depth that made him question everything he thought he knew about these creatures. The massive animal's posture, while intimidating, lacked the aggressive stance he'd expect from a mother separated from her cubs. Instead, she seemed to be waiting. Slowly, Ethan backed away, maintaining eye contact but showing no aggression. His mind raced through years of experience, trying to make sense of this unusual behavior. The bear's response defied everything he had learned about wildlife encounters. She watched him retreat, then disappeared into the darkness with a deliberate grace that left him questioning his sanity. The following days brought changes to the forest that Ethan couldn't ignore. Trees that had stood for decades mysteriously toppled overnight, blocking certain paths while creating new ones. The usual wildlife patterns shifted dramatically. Smaller animals that normally frequented his property began taking wide detours around the cabin. At first, he attributed these changes to natural phenomena, but the precision with which they occurred suggested something more intentional. One morning, while checking on the cubs, who were growing stronger by the day, Ethan noticed fresh tire tracks cutting through a rarely used trail. His heart rate quickened as he recognized the distinctive pattern of heavy-duty hunting vehicles. Further investigation revealed carefully hidden traps scattered throughout the area, professional-grade equipment that spoke of organized illegal hunting operations. The discovery stirred memories he'd fought hard to suppress. Images flashed through his mind, a distant forest, similar traps, and a sequence of events that had driven him to this solitary existence. His hands trembled slightly as he disabled the first trap, muscle memory taking over despite the years that had passed. Each mechanism he dismantled felt like confronting another piece of his past. The cubs, now able to move around more freely, seemed to sense his unease. The smallest one, whom he'd started calling Shadow for its habit of following him around, pressed against his leg as he worked. The gesture, so trusting and innocent, made his chest tighten with emotion. These creatures had somehow broken through barriers he'd spent years building, awakening a protective instinct he thought he'd lost. Late that afternoon, while tracking the extent of the hunting operation's presence, Ethan encountered something that made him freeze in his tracks. Fresh boot prints, leading to a recently cleared area, told him someone had been watching his cabin. The precision of the surveillance spoke of professional experience, and a chill ran down his spine as he recognized certain markers. These weren't amateur hunters. Returning to check on the cubs, Ethan found the mother bear had visited during his absence. She had left fresh fish near the shelter, an offering that left him baffled. The cubs devoured the food eagerly, while Ethan stood watch, trying to make sense of this unprecedented behavior. The mother's actions seemed almost cooperative, as if she understood that her cub's survival currently depended on this unusual alliance. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan sat at his small desk, poring over old maps of the area. The patterns of the hunters' movements suggested they were searching for something specific. As he traced possible routes with his finger, a flash of movement outside his window caught his attention. The mother bear stood at the edge of the clearing, and beside her was a sight that made him question his eyes. Several other bears had emerged from the forest, moving with an eerie synchronization. The bears began a systematic patrol of the area, their movements so coordinated it appeared choreographed. Ethan watched, transfixed, as they methodically checked each approach to his cabin and the cubs' shelter. The display sent his mind racing back to stories he'd heard from local indigenous peoples, tales he'd dismissed as mere folklore about bears acting as forest guardians. A sudden knock at his door shattered the surreal moment. Ethan's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, but he hesitated. Through the window, he could see a single figure standing on his porch, a man whose presence would change everything. Even before opening the door, Ethan knew this visitor would force him to confront the very past he'd fled to Alaska to escape. The man standing on Ethan's porch exuded an air of dangerous charm. His expensive outdoor gear and confident stance marked him as someone used to getting his way. Gavin Rhodes, he introduced himself with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We need to talk about your interference in local affairs." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he maintained a neutral expression. He recognized the name. Gavin Rhodes was notorious in hunting circles for his disregard of environmental regulations and his ruthless pursuit of profit. The man's reputation preceded him. Wherever Rhodes went, ecosystems suffered. "I'm not interfering with anything," Ethan responded carefully, keeping his position in the doorway. Behind Rhodes, he could see several more figures emerging from the shadows, all carrying high-end hunting equipment. The strategic positioning of Rhodes's men wasn't lost on Ethan. They had surrounded his cabin. "Come now, Mr. Walker. Your reputation in the hunting world may be complicated, but surely you understand business opportunities when you see them." Rhodes's voice carried a hint of amusement. "Those cubs you're harboring, they're part of a larger picture, one that doesn't concern you." The mention of his past made Ethan's muscles tense. Few people knew about his former life, and fewer still knew why he'd left it behind. Rhodes's casual reference to it was clearly meant as a threat. In the distance, a deep growl echoed through the trees, and Ethan noticed Rhodes's men shifting uncomfortably. "The Forest Service might be interested in your business opportunities," Ethan suggested quietly, watching Rhodes's reaction. The man's smile widened, becoming predatory. "The local authorities understand the economic benefits of our operation," Rhodes replied smoothly, "and they're quite good at looking the other way when properly motivated. Your isolation up here has left you out of touch with how things work nowadays." As if nature itself wanted to punctuate Rhodes's threat, a massive tree suddenly crashed down nearby, making several of his men jump. Ethan noticed how Rhodes's confident expression faltered slightly at the sound. The forest had been doing this more frequently, trees falling in strategic locations, creating barriers and blocking access to certain areas. "Consider this a friendly warning," Rhodes continued, regaining his composure. "Stay out of our way. Those cubs aren't your concern, and neither is this forest. You came here to escape your past, didn't you? Don't force yourself back into a world you chose to leave behind." Before Ethan could respond, movement in the underbrush caught everyone's attention. The mother bear emerged into the clearing, her massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky. She stood upright, towering over everything, and let out a roar that seemed to shake the very ground. Rhodes's men instinctively raised their weapons, but their leader held up a hand, stopping them. "Interesting," Rhodes mused, studying the scene with calculating eyes. "It seems you've made some unusual allies, Walker. But remember, nature can be unpredictable." With that thinly veiled threat, he gestured to his men, and they melted back into the forest as smoothly as they had appeared. Once they were gone, Ethan watched as the mother bear lowered herself back to all fours and approached the cub's shelter. Her behavior continued to astound him. Instead of acting aggressively, she seemed to be working in concert with him, protecting not just her cubs, but the entire area around his cabin. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan pulled out an old journal he hadn't touched in years. Its pages contained detailed accounts of his past experiences, including the incident that had driven him into isolation. As he flipped through the weathered pages, he realized that running away hadn't solved anything. It had just postponed an inevitable confrontation with the darker side of human nature. The next morning brought more signs of Rhodes's operation. New traps had been set, more sophisticated than before, and Ethan found evidence of surveillance equipment hidden in the trees. But something else caught his attention. Strange markings carved into certain trees, symbols he didn't recognize but that seemed deliberately placed. Following these markers led him deeper into the forest, where he discovered something unexpected, a hidden cave entrance, its mouth partially concealed by vegetation. The cave entrance beckoned to Ethan like a gateway to another world. As he stood contemplating whether to enter, the smallest of the cubs, Shadow, appeared beside him, followed closely by its siblings. Their presence here couldn't be coincidence. They moved with purpose, as if they knew exactly where they were going. Against his better judgment, Ethan followed them into the darkness. The beam of his flashlight revealed walls covered in ancient markings, intricate symbols depicting bears in various poses, some standing as guardians, others leading what appeared to be humans through the forest. Trees and rivers were woven throughout the artwork, creating a tapestry of interconnected life. The sophistication of the artwork suggested this wasn't just prehistoric graffiti, it told a story. "They've been waiting for someone like you," a quiet voice said behind him, making Ethan spin around. An elderly indigenous man stood there, his presence somehow both surprising and natural at the same time. He wore modern clothing, but something about him seemed timeless, as if he belonged to both the present and the past. "The bears?" Ethan asked, trying to mask his startlement at the man's silent approach. The elder nodded, running his hand along one of the cave walls. "The forest chooses its guardians carefully. Sometimes they're bears, sometimes they're men. Sometimes they're both." His eyes, sharp despite his age, studied Ethan intently. "You've been running from your role for too long." Ethan's mind flashed to the incident that had driven him into isolation. "I'm not a guardian of anything," he said firmly. "I'm just trying to help these cubs." The old man smiled knowingly. "Yet the mother bear trusts you. The forest responds to your presence. Even now, it's working to protect what matters." He gestured to the cave paintings. "Our ancestors understood this connection. They knew that when destructive forces threatened the balance, the forest would choose its defenders." As if to emphasize his words, a distant rumble echoed through the cave. The cubs, who had been exploring nearby, pressed closer to Ethan. He noticed how they seemed completely at ease with the elderly man's presence, as if they recognized him as part of this mysterious world. "Rhodes and his men," the elder continued, his voice hardening slightly. "They represent an old threat in a new form. They see the forest as something to be conquered, exploited. They don't understand that it's alive, aware, that it remembers." Ethan thought about the falling trees, the changed animal patterns, the mother bear's unusual behavior. "You're saying these aren't coincidences? That somehow the forest is responding?" "You've seen it yourself. The bears aren't just animals to be hunted or protected. They're part of an ancient system of balance. When that balance is threatened, the forest finds ways to defend itself." The elder pointed to a specific section of the cave art, showing bears and humans working together to protect the trees and rivers. A soft growl drew their attention to the cave entrance. The mother bear stood there, her massive form blocking most of the light from outside. But instead of fear, Ethan felt a strange sense of recognition. The elder nodded, as if confirming something. "She's been watching you, evaluating you," he explained. "When you chose to help her cubs, you took the first step on a path you've been avoiding. The forest remembers your past, Ethan Walker. It knows why you left your old life behind. But running from who you are doesn't change what needs to be done." The cubs moved toward their mother, but instead of leaving with her, they stayed in the space between her and Ethan, creating a bridge between man and beast. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. It reflected the very scenes painted on the cave walls centuries ago. "Rhodes won't stop," Ethan said. thinking about the threats and the growing evidence of their operation. He's planning something big. The elder's expression grew grave. No, he won't stop. Men like him never do. That's why the forest needs its guardians, both human and animal. The question is, are you ready to stop running and face what's coming? The following days brought an escalation that Ethan couldn't ignore. While checking the perimeter of his property, he discovered disturbing signs of Rhodes's expanding operation. Containers of fuel had been strategically placed throughout the forest, their presence a clear indication of what was to come. The realization hit him hard. Rhodes was planning to force their hand through fire. The mother bear's behavior had also changed. She now spent more time near the cabin, her massive form a constant presence in the periphery of Ethan's vision. The cubs, growing stronger each day, seemed to sense the increasing tension. They stayed closer to the makeshift shelter, their playful nature subdued by the growing unease in the forest. Ethan found himself at the local ranger station, hoping to alert the authorities about Rhodes's activities. The response he received confirmed his worst fears. The ranger, a nervous man who couldn't meet his eyes, shuffled papers on his desk while making excuses. "We haven't seen any evidence of illegal activity in that area, Mr. Walker. Perhaps you're being a bit paranoid." The implied message was clear. Rhodes's influence ran deep. As Ethan left the station, he noticed several expensive vehicles parked in the back, their mud-splattered sides suggesting recent off-road use. The sight confirmed what the elder had told him about corruption reaching into local institutions. Back at his cabin, Ethan began preparing for what he knew would come. His past experience as a professional hunter had taught him to read signs, to understand patterns. Rhodes's operation was moving with too much precision, too much purpose. They weren't just after the bears, they were after something bigger. The elder appeared again that evening, materializing from the forest shadows like a spirit. "They found traces of valuable minerals in the area," he explained, his weathered face grave. "Rhodes plans to clear the forest, drive out the wildlife. The bears are just the beginning." A series of loud crashes in the distance punctuated his words. More trees falling, but this time Ethan recognized the sound of machinery mixed with the natural chaos. Rhodes's men were moving their equipment into position, preparing for their final push. The mother bear emerged from the tree line, moving with deliberate purpose. To Ethan's amazement, she was followed by several other bears, their massive forms moving in perfect coordination. The elder nodded at the sight, as if this confirmed something he had known all along. "The forest is gathering its defenders," he said quietly. "But it needs all of them, including you, Ethan Walker." The smallest cub, Shadow, pressed against Ethan's leg, looking up at him with trust that made his chest tighten. The other cubs joined their sibling, creating a circle of warmth and purpose around him. The mother bear watched this interaction, her intelligent eyes reflecting something that seemed almost like approval. As night fell, the forest came alive with unusual activity. Animals moved through the darkness with strange purpose, their normal patterns altered by some unseen force. The elder explained that the forest was preparing, responding to the threat in ways that modern science couldn't explain, but indigenous wisdom had long understood. Ethan spent the night reviewing old maps of the area, marking the locations where he'd found fuel containers and equipment. A pattern emerged. Rhodes wasn't just planning to start a fire. He was preparing to create a controlled burn that would drive all wildlife from the area while making it appear like a natural disaster. The sound of helicopters in the distance confirmed his suspicions. Rhodes was bringing in more equipment, more men. The scale of the operation was larger than Ethan had initially suspected. As he watched from his cabin window, he saw lights moving through the forest. Rhodes' men conducting night operations, preparing for their final assault. The mother bear appeared at the edge of the clearing, her form silhouetted against the darkness. She seemed to be waiting, watching, as if she understood exactly what was at stake. Behind her, more bears emerged from the shadows, their numbers growing until the tree line was filled with their massive forms. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the confrontation that would decide its fate. The morning brought an eerie calm to the forest. Ethan watched as unusual patterns emerged in the wildlife behavior around his cabin. Birds that normally competed for territory now shared branches, their songs mixing in strange harmony. Smaller animals moved with deliberate purpose, as if following an unseen map of the forest. The three cubs had grown noticeably stronger under his care, but their playful nature had been replaced by an almost preternatural awareness. Shadow, the smallest, stood watch at the shelter's entrance, its siblings flanking it like miniature sentinels. Their behavior reminded Ethan of the cave paintings, bears acting as guardians, protectors of the forest's ancient balance. A series of mechanical sounds echoing through the trees broke the morning's stillness. Rhodes's operation was moving into position. Through his binoculars, Ethan could see heavy equipment being assembled at strategic points around the forest. The scale of the operation confirmed his worst fears. Rhodes wasn't just after the bears, he planned to transform the entire ecosystem. The elder appeared beside Ethan, moving as silently as ever. "The forest remembers other times like this," he said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "When men came with machines and fire, thinking they could bend nature to their will. But they forgot that the forest has its own ways of fighting back." As if in response to his words, a massive tree suddenly crashed down near one of Rhodes's equipment staging areas. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. The tree had fallen exactly where it would cause the most disruption to the operation. Ethan had seen too many similar accidents lately to dismiss them as chance. "How is this possible?" Ethan asked, watching as Rhodes's men scrambled to clear the obstacle. "Trees don't just fall with that kind of precision." The elder smiled mysteriously. "The forest is more aware than most people realize. It communicates in ways modern science is only beginning to understand. The bears, they're part of this ancient network. They don't just live in the forest, they're connected to it in ways we've forgotten." The mother bear emerged from the tree line, followed by her growing contingent of ursine allies. Their movements were coordinated, almost strategic, as they patrolled the perimeter of Ethan's property. The cubs watched their mother from the shelter, their behavior showing a maturity beyond their age. "Rhodes's men are getting nervous," Ethan observed, noting how the workers kept looking over their shoulders, jumping at every sound from the forest. "They can sense something's not right. Nature has its own way of inspiring fear in those who would harm it," the elder replied. "But Rhodes is different. He's driven by greed and ambition. He won't stop unless he's forced to." A helicopter appeared overhead, its rotors beating against the morning air. Ethan recognized Rhodes' distinctive figure as he stepped out of the aircraft, his expensive outdoor gear marking him as someone who viewed nature as something to be conquered rather than respected. The man's confident stride spoke of someone used to getting his way, regardless of the cost. The forest's response was immediate and dramatic. A strong wind whipped through the trees, sending branches crashing down around Rhodes's position. The helicopter pilot, visibly unnerved, had to fight to maintain control of his aircraft. The bears, led by the mother, moved into defensive positions, their massive forms creating living barriers between Rhodes's men and the heart of the forest. "The ancient spirits are stirring," the elder said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "They remember when humans and bears worked together as guardians. They've been waiting for someone who could bridge that gap again." Ethan watched as Shadow and its siblings moved to stand beside him, their presence a physical reminder of the choice he faced. The mother bear turned to look at him, her eyes holding an intelligence that seemed to transcend the natural world. In that moment, Ethan understood that his past had been preparing him for this, not as a hunter, but as a protector. Rhodes's next move came swiftly and decisively. His men began positioning equipment around the forest's perimeter, their movements suggesting a carefully orchestrated plan. Ethan observed them through his binoculars, his experienced eye noting the telltale signs of an imminent operation. The fuel containers he'd discovered earlier were being moved into strategic positions, creating a ring around the area. "They're going to try to start the fire tonight," Ethan told the elder, who had remained a constant presence throughout the day. "Rhodes is planning to make it look like a natural disaster, something that would force evacuation of the entire area." The elder nodded gravely. "The forest knows. Listen." He gestured to the surrounding trees, where an unusual silence had fallen. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that made the hair on Ethan's neck stand up. The mother bear had positioned herself near the cub's shelter, her massive form a protective barrier against any threat. The other bears had spread throughout the forest, their presence creating an invisible network of guardians. Ethan noticed how they seemed to move in response to some unspoken command, adjusting their positions as Rhodes's men advanced. Shadow and its siblings had grown remarkably in the short time under Ethan's care. Their movements now showed strength and purpose, far from the weak creatures he'd found on that fateful day. They stayed close to their mother, but kept their eyes on Ethan, as if understanding that their fates were now intertwined with his. A commotion from Rhodes's camp drew their attention. Several of his men were arguing, their voices carrying through the still air. Ethan could make out fragments of their conversation. Some of them were expressing doubts about the operation. The strange events in the forest had begun to affect morale, making even hardened hunters nervous about their mission. Rhodes's response was immediate and harsh. His commanding voice cut through the dissent, reminding his men of their substantial paycheck and threatening consequences for any who backed out. But Ethan could see the fear in their body language, the way they jumped at every sound from the forest. The elder touched Ethan's arm, drawing his attention to something remarkable. The trees at the edge of the clearing were moving, their branches swaying against the wind. As they watched, several massive trunks began to slowly tilt, their roots pulling free from the earth with deliberate precision. "The forest is creating barriers," the elder explained, his voice filled with wonder. "It's protecting its own." The falling trees blocked key access points that Rhodes's men had been planning to use, forcing them to adjust their strategy. Rhodes's reaction to these setbacks revealed his true nature. His carefully maintained facade of sophisticated businessman cracked, showing glimpses of the ruthless destroyer beneath. He began shouting orders, demanding his men push forward regardless of the obstacles. His determination to succeed had transformed into something dangerous and desperate. The mother bear suddenly tensed, her attention focused on movement in the underbrush. Two of Rhodes's men had managed to slip closer to the cub's shelter, taking advantage of the growing darkness. Before they could act, the forest itself seemed to respond. Vines and branches twisted in impossible ways, creating natural barriers that forced them to retreat. "The ancient spirits are fully awake now," the elder said, watching the display of nature's power. "They remember times like this, when the balance was threatened. But they need a human guardian to work through, someone who understands both worlds." Ethan felt the weight of the elder's words. His past as a hunter had taught him to read the forest, to understand its patterns and rhythms. Now those same skills were needed for protection rather than pursuit. The cubs moved closer to him, their trust evident in every movement. Shadow pressed against his leg, looking up at him with eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. As night approached, the tension in the forest reached a breaking point. Rhodes's men had completed their preparations, positioning themselves for what they planned to be their final assault on the area. The forest had responded by gathering its own defenders, bears positioned strategically throughout the area, trees that seemed to move of their own accord, and wildlife behaving in unprecedented ways. Standing at this crossroads, Ethan realized that every event in his life had led him to this moment. His skills as a hunter, his understanding of the forest, even his self-imposed isolation, all of it had been preparation for the role he now needed to play. The mother bear turned to look at him, her gaze holding a question that would define not just his future, but the fate of this ancient forest and all its inhabitants. The first signs of Rhodes's final assault came with the setting sun. His men moved through the darkening forest with military precision, setting up equipment and preparing their positions. Through his binoculars, Ethan could see them placing incendiary devices, sophisticated equipment designed to create a controlled burn that would appear natural to investigators. "They're more organized than typical poachers," Ethan observed, noting their tactical positioning. "These men have training." He shared his observations with the elder, who had been studying the movements with equal intensity. "Rhodes recruits from private security firms," the elder explained. "Men who value money over morality. But even they can feel the forest's power. Look at how they hesitate, how they keep checking over their shoulders." Indeed, despite their professional demeanor, Rhodes's men showed signs of increasing unease. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, creating an atmosphere of tension that seemed to press against them like a physical force. Even their electronic equipment began malfunctioning, communications devices crackling with strange interference. The mother bear had gathered her cubs closer to Ethan's cabin, positioning them where they could be better protected. Shadow, showing remarkable intelligence, kept watch alongside its siblings, their behavior more reminiscent of trained guardians than young wild animals. Other bears had taken up positions throughout the forest, creating a living barrier between Rhodes's men and their objectives. Ethan noticed changes in the forest itself, subtle at first, then increasingly dramatic. Trees seemed to shift their positions overnight, creating natural barriers that forced Rhodes's men to constantly adjust their plans. The ground beneath their equipment became unstable, causing vehicles to sink into suddenly soft earth. Nature itself appeared to be mounting a defense against the invaders. Rhodes arrived by helicopter again, his frustration evident in his aggressive stride as he surveyed the situation. "Walker!" he shouted across the clearing, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "This is your last chance to walk away. What happens next won't be pleasant for anyone who stands in our way." The elder touched Ethan's arm, drawing his attention to something remarkable. Dark clouds had begun gathering overhead, despite weather reports predicting clear skies. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, an ancient power that seemed to pulse through the very air. "The forest remembers other guardians," the elder said softly. "Other times when it had to defend itself. It's gathering its strength, but it needs someone to focus its power, someone who understands both the old ways and the new." The mother bear moved to stand beside Ethan, her massive presence a physical manifestation of nature's strength. The cubs gathered around them, creating a circle that seemed to pulse with energy. Other wildlife began emerging from the forest, wolves, eagles, even smaller creatures, all behaving in ways that defied natural instinct, moving with clear purpose and unity. Rhodes's reaction to these developments revealed the first cracks in his confident facade. His men reported equipment failures, inexplicable accidents, and growing unrest among their ranks. Some had already abandoned their posts, unnerved by the strange events unfolding around them. "The forest is alive," the elder explained, watching as more of Rhodes's men began to waver. Not just in the way scientists understand, but in a deeper, older way. It remembers when humans and animals worked together as guardians. It's been waiting for someone who could bridge that gap again. Ethan felt something stirring within him, a connection to the forest that went beyond his years of experience as a hunter. The cubs pressed closer to him, their trust absolute. Shadow looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom, reminding him of the cave paintings he'd seen earlier. The storm clouds overhead grew darker, swirling with unnatural purpose. Lightning flickered within them, but instead of random strikes, the bolts seemed to dance around the edges of the forest, creating a barrier of electrical energy that made Rhodes's men retreat from their positions. "They're going to make their move tonight," Ethan said, recognizing the signs of an imminent operation. "Rhodes won't let all his preparation go to waste. He'll try to start the fire before this storm breaks." The elder nodded gravely. "The forest knows. It's preparing its own response, but it needs you, Ethan Walker. Your past, your skills, even your mistakes, they've all led you to this moment. The question is, are you ready to embrace your role as a guardian?" The night exploded into chaos as Rhodes made his move. The first fires started at the forest's edge, strategically placed to appear like natural ignition points. His men moved with practiced efficiency, setting up containment lines that would direct the blaze exactly where they wanted it to go. The wind, however, had other plans. Ethan watched in amazement as the gathering storm responded to the threat. Wind patterns shifted erratically, working against Rhodes's carefully planned fire corridors. The elder stood beside him, his weathered face showing no surprise at nature's rebellion against human interference. "The forest protects its own," the elder said calmly, even as chaos erupted around them. "But it needs those who understand both worlds to guide its power." The mother bear suddenly rose to her full height, letting out a roar that seemed to shake the earth itself. Other bears emerged from the darkness, moving with unprecedented coordination. They created living barriers between the spreading flames and the heart of the forest, while smaller animals worked in strange harmony to clear paths and create natural fire breaks. Shadow and its siblings showed remarkable courage, staying close to Ethan but maintaining a vigilant watch over their surroundings. Their behavior seemed to transcend normal animal instincts, displaying an almost supernatural awareness of the unfolding situation. Rhodes's frustration became evident as his carefully laid plans began to unravel. "This is impossible," he shouted, watching as another perfectly positioned fire line was thwarted by a sudden shift in the wind. "Walker, I know you're behind this somehow." Ethan moved through the forest with purpose, using his knowledge of the terrain to disrupt Rhodes's operation. The bears followed his lead, their massive forms providing protection as he worked to sabotage the equipment and expose the truth of Rhodes's activities. The storm intensified, but in ways that defied natural weather patterns. Lightning struck with impossible precision, igniting controlled backfires that protected vital areas of the forest. Rain fell in selective areas, dampening Rhodes's attempt to spread the flames while leaving other parts of the forest dry enough for the wildlife to move freely. Several of Rhodes's men, witnessing these inexplicable events, began to abandon their posts. The forest's response to their invasion had become too obvious to ignore, too powerful to fight against. Their training hadn't prepared them for a situation where nature itself seemed to rise up against them. "The ancient spirits remember other battles like this," the elder explained, watching as more of Rhodes's operation fell into disarray. "Times when the balance was threatened and the forest had to defend itself. But it's been waiting for someone who could unite both worlds, human and animal, modern and ancient." Ethan understood now why he had been drawn to this place, why he had felt compelled to help those 3 weak cubs months ago. His past as a hunter had given him the skills needed to protect rather than harm, to understand the delicate balance of nature and help maintain it. The mother bear moved alongside him with fluid grace, her presence a reminder of the trust that had been placed in him. Together, they coordinated their movements through the forest, leading Rhodes's men into natural traps while protecting vital areas from destruction. Shadow and its siblings had grown into their role as forest guardians, their actions showing an understanding that went beyond mere animal instinct. They worked in perfect harmony with their mother and Ethan, creating a bridge between the human and animal worlds that the elder had spoken of. As the night wore on, Rhodes's desperate attempts to salvage his operation became increasingly reckless. He ordered his remaining men to concentrate their efforts on the area around Ethan's cabin, hoping to force a confrontation. But the forest's response was swift and decisive. Trees fell with strategic precision, blocking access routes and protecting key positions. The storm reached its peak, creating a spectacle of nature's power that none of Rhodes's remaining men could ignore. Lightning illuminated the sky in patterns that seemed to form ancient symbols, while the wind carried sounds that resonated with primordial meaning. The forest was making its final stand, and it had chosen its guardians well. The confrontation reached its climax as Rhodes's remaining forces gathered for one final push. The forest, however, had transformed into something beyond their understanding. Trees swayed against the wind, creating barriers and pathways that seemed to move with conscious purpose. The mother bear stood at the center of this natural revolution, her presence a catalyst for events that defied explanation. "They're going to try to overwhelm us with sheer numbers," Ethan observed, watching Rhodes's men regroup. "They don't understand what they're really fighting against." The elder nodded sagely. "They see only trees and animals. They cannot comprehend the ancient force that connects all living things, but you do, Ethan Walker. You've learned to see with both sets of eyes, those of a hunter and those of a guardian." Shadow and its siblings had positioned themselves strategically around the clearing, their behavior showing remarkable coordination with the adult bears. The transformation from helpless cubs to confident guardians was complete, their presence a testament to the forest's ability to nurture and strengthen its defenders. Rhodes, his composure finally cracking, ordered his men to advance with their remaining equipment. "Burn it all," he shouted, his voice carrying traces of desperation. "We'll sort out the consequences later." The forest's response was immediate and overwhelming. The storm that had been building reached a fever pitch, but with an unnatural precision that spoke of ancient powers at work. Lightning struck in perfect patterns, creating barriers of light and energy that forced Rhodes's men to retreat from their positions. The mother bear let out a roar that seemed to shake the very foundation of the earth. Other bears emerged from the darkness, moving with orchestrated purpose. They formed living walls, protecting vital areas of the forest while herding Rhodes's men away from their objectives. Ethan moved through this chaos with newfound purpose, his years of experience as a hunter now serving a different cause. He worked in perfect synchronization with the bears, using his knowledge of the terrain to disrupt Rhodes's operations while staying safely out of reach. "The forest remembers," the elder said, watching as nature itself seemed to rise up against the invaders. "It remembers when humans and animals work together as guardians. That memory has been sleeping, waiting for someone who could awaken it." Rhodes's men, facing this unprecedented display of natural force, began to break ranks. Even their military training couldn't prepare them for trees that moved with purpose, for animals that worked in coordinated patterns, for a forest that seemed alive with ancient consciousness. The mother bear's attention suddenly shifted to a new threat. Rhodes, seeing his plans crumbling, had taken matters into his own hands. He approached the cubs' shelter with clear intent, perhaps hoping to use them as leverage. But before he could act, the forest intervened in a spectacular display of power. The ground beneath Rhodes's feet became unstable, roots and vines moving with serpentine grace to entangle his movements. The wind intensified, creating a localized vortex that scattered his remaining equipment. The bears moved in perfect formation, cutting off any possibility of retreat. Shadow and its siblings, showing courage that belied their youth, stood their ground between Rhodes and their mother. Their eyes held an intelligence that seemed to transcend their natural instincts, a wisdom born from their unique position between the world of humans and the ancient forces of nature. Ethan stepped forward, finally confronting Rhodes directly. "You never understood what you were really fighting against," he said, his voice carrying over the storm's fury. "This isn't just about land or resources, it's about balance, a balance that's existed long before us and will continue long after." The elder's voice cut through the chaos. "The forest has chosen its guardians. It has found those who understand both worlds, the ancient and the modern, the human and the natural. This is what you've been running from, Ethan Walker. Not your past, but your destiny." The storm reached its peak as Rhodes faced the consequences of his actions. His remaining men, witnessing the forest's unprecedented display of power, began dropping their equipment and retreating. The sophisticated operation that had seemed unstoppable just hours ago now crumbled in the face of nature's unified response. "This is insanity!" Rhodes shouted, his carefully maintained facade finally shattering completely. "It's just a forest, just trees and animals." But even as he spoke, the evidence before him told a different story. The coordinated movements of the bears, the strategic falling of trees, and the precise patterns of the storm all spoke of an intelligence that defied his understanding. The mother bear moved forward with deliberate grace, her massive form radiating an authority that transcended physical presence. Shadow and its siblings flanked her, their movements showing a maturity and purpose that seemed impossible for their age. They had evolved from helpless cubs into true guardians of the forest. Ethan stepped forward, positioning himself between Rhodes and the bears. "You've lost," he said simply. "The forest has made its choice." As if to emphasize his words, the wind shifted dramatically, creating a barrier of swirling leaves and debris that forced Rhodes's remaining men further back. The elder appeared beside them, his presence somehow both ancient and timeless. "The balance must be maintained," he explained, his voice carrying over the storm's fury. "When it's threatened, the forest finds ways to defend itself. But it needs those who can bridge both worlds, those who understand both human ways and nature's law." Rhodes made one final desperate attempt to salvage his operation. He pulled out a remote detonator, threatening to trigger the remaining incendiary devices scattered throughout the forest. "If I can't have this land, no one will," he declared, his finger hovering over the button. But the forest had anticipated even this. Roots burst from the ground with impossible speed, wrapping around the detonator and pulling it from his grasp. The mother bear rose to her full height, letting out a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Other bears emerged from the darkness, forming a circle around Rhodes that left him no avenue of escape. The storm intensified, but with remarkable precision. Lightning struck key points around the forest, igniting controlled burns that quickly consumed Rhodes's abandoned equipment while leaving the natural environment untouched. The wind patterns shifted, creating corridors that guided the remaining fire away from vulnerable areas. Shadow approached Ethan, pressing against his leg in a gesture of trust that bridged the gap between human and animal worlds. The other cubs followed, their presence creating a physical manifestation of the connection between man and nature that the elder had spoken of. "The forest remembers," the elder said, watching as Rhodes's empire crumbled before nature's power. "It remembers when humans and animals worked together as guardians. That memory has been waiting for someone who could awaken it, someone who understood both the old ways and the new." The remaining members of Rhodes's team, witnessing these extraordinary events, laid down their weapons and equipment. Some even stepped forward to help contain the fires their own actions had started, as if awakening to the reality of what they had been part of. Local authorities, finally alerted to the situation by the spectacular display of nature's power, began arriving at the scene. They found extensive evidence of Rhodes's illegal operations, along with documentation that exposed the full scope of his environmental crimes. His network of corruption began to unravel as officials from higher jurisdictions took notice of the situation. The mother bear watched these developments with an almost human understanding. Her cubs gathered around her. She turned to Ethan, and in that moment, he felt the full weight of the responsibility he had accepted. This wasn't just about protecting 3 cubs anymore. It was about maintaining the delicate balance between human development and natural preservation. As the night's chaos began to settle, the storm gradually subsided, but the forest's power remained palpable in the air. The bears had shown themselves to be more than mere animals, the trees more than simple plants. They were part of an ancient system of balance that had found its voice through the unlikely partnership of a former hunter and the creatures he had chosen to protect. In the days that followed the confrontation, the forest began healing itself with remarkable efficiency. The areas damaged by Rhodes's operation showed signs of unprecedented recovery, with new growth emerging at an extraordinary rate. Ethan, watching this restoration from his cabin porch, realized that his own healing had begun as well. The mother bear and her cubs remained close to his cabin, but their relationship had evolved into something that defied conventional understanding. Shadow, no longer the weak cub he had first encountered, had grown into a confident young bear that seemed to bridge the gap between wild and domestic worlds. Its siblings displayed similar development, showing an intelligence and awareness that went beyond natural instinct. The forest has always needed guardians, the elder explained, sitting beside Ethan one evening. In ancient times, this role was understood and honored. People knew that maintaining the balance required both human wisdom and natural instinct. Somewhere along the way, we forgot this truth. The changes in the forest were subtle but significant. Wildlife patterns had shifted, creating new harmonies that even experienced naturalists found remarkable. The bears, under the mother's leadership, had established a new kind of order in the area. They weren't just surviving, they were actively maintaining the balance of the ecosystem. Rhodes's arrest had triggered a cascade of investigations that exposed widespread corruption in local environmental enforcement. As higher authorities took control, new protective measures were put in place to preserve the unique character of the forest. Ethan found himself consulted as an expert on the area, his knowledge of both human and natural worlds proving invaluable. "You've found your true calling," the elder observed, watching as Ethan worked with conservation officials to document the forest's unique properties. Not as a hunter, but as a protector. The forest chose well. Shadow and its siblings had grown into their roles as intermediaries between the human and natural worlds. They maintained their close connection with Ethan while remaining true to their wild nature. Their presence served as a living reminder of the moment when everything changed, when a solitary man's act of compassion awakened ancient forces of protection and renewal. The mother bear's influence extended beyond her immediate family. Other bears in the area began showing similar signs of heightened awareness and purpose. They worked in concert with the forest itself, maintaining boundaries and protecting vulnerable areas with an intelligence that amazed observers. Ethan's cabin, once a refuge for a man running from his past, had transformed into a center of forest stewardship. His experience as a hunter, combined with his new role as guardian, provided unique insights into maintaining the delicate balance between human activity and natural preservation. The cave with its ancient paintings became a sacred place of learning, where the elder shared traditional knowledge with those who showed genuine interest in understanding the forest's deeper mysteries. The symbols on its walls seemed more alive now, telling stories of a time when humans and animals worked together as guardians of natural balance. One evening, as the sun set over the transformed landscape, Ethan stood with the elder, watching Shadow and its family patrol the forest edges. The bears moved with purpose and grace, their actions showing a clear understanding of their role in the greater scheme of things. "The forest remembers," the elder said softly. "It remembers those who protect it, those who understand the true meaning of balance. This is not an ending, Ethan Walker, Ethan. It's a return to something ancient and true, a beginning that is also a continuation." As if confirming his words, the mother bear approached them, her cubs now strong and confident beside her. She regarded Ethan with eyes that held wisdom beyond nature's normal bounds. In that moment, he understood that his journey had not been about escaping his past, but about finding his true purpose. The forest had not just been saved, it had been awakened, and with it, an ancient partnership between human and natural worlds had been renewed. The story of Ethan Walker and the bears became a testament to the power of redemption and the enduring connection between humans and nature. It served as a reminder that sometimes the greatest transformations come not from running away from our past, but from embracing our role in maintaining the delicate balance of the natural world. Dear listeners, we hope this tale of Ethan Walker and his remarkable journey has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched ours. To continue exploring such extraordinary stories of connection between humans and nature, we've prepared a special playlist filled with equally captivating narratives. You'll find it by clicking the link to your left. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel and giving this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the profound mysteries of life and nature. Join us in the comments section below to share your thoughts about this remarkable tale of transformation and redemption. Until our next story, remember that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a single act of compassion.